And say your name, please.
My name is Rob Benson, and what else do you want to know? Ambiguous at best. I don't know. I guess I'm pretty open. I think I usually end up describing myself as queer to people because it's something that's easily recognizable. Like I usually know about how that's going to trigger someone if I bring it up in a conversation, and it's not too far off. I don't know if I actually identify as queer though. I think that I like what a lot of different communities and movements have aligned themselves with in terms of activism and talking about identity politics. That those movements identify as queer, and so it's a comfortable space for me usually, but I think that the language still inherently has a lot of problems in that as soon as you invoke queerness, I think you're inherently talking about a kind of othering and marginalization that's very present, and given I think that's present in society, it's a reality that people are marginalized and victimized, but I think it emphasizes that in a really weird way that makes people an easy target. Not in the sense of being victimized or being harassed or assaulted, because I think if someone's going to do that, they're going to do it anyway, because they're an asshole of a person. But I think in the sense that you make yourself vulnerable almost in a marketing sense. Someone can come along that's a politician or a company or a pop star and whoever, and say, well, I understand your suffering. I understand what you've been through. I know what it's like to be different. Follow me and I'll show you the answer. And I guess I just realized that I hadn't really spoken to a lot of my friends who do sex work about how it came to be a factor in their life. But for me, it was very gradual. I remember probably my first year of college, someone that I was sort of loosely working with in the women's center on campus came up to me and propositioned me. He wanted to pay me to give me a blowjob, and at the time I was a broke kid and I needed money, and so I did it. And it just sort of was like an on and off thing, and then once I got out to New York, I needed to make a living wage and have a flexible schedule, and so it was something that I knew I could do because I had done it before, and it filled a practical role more than anything. I was telling you earlier, up until that point I was working 2 full-time jobs, one in retail and one for a retail store that was, my role was mainly construction. But nothing paid a living wage. I didn't have a degree, I didn't have an amazing resume, despite whatever skill sets I had, and so in order to make the money that I needed out here, not only to survive, but to produce the work that I came here to do, it was a job that made sense. I don't know. I relate to most things as a sexual being. I started sewing when I was really young, and so I think in a way I've always related to it as an identity thing, as a way of presenting myself in public spaces, and in turn I've related to that as a crucial part of really any movement or historical moment or individual. I think people really, because of the role that fashion takes in our society, I think people really underrate it. I think, people think fashion and they think Vogue or, Runway and Marc Jacobs taking over the city with 1 million stores, and that's not even the tip of the iceberg of what it means to me. I think that mode and these ideas of normativity that surround how people present themselves in public spaces, and these little signifiers that we place on our physical bodies to let people know how we identify are so critical, and the way that we can play with those is really there's so much potential for finding new ways to communicate. My emphasis as a designer has shifted in the past year or so from a typical market stance of, I'm going to create this collection that's a seasonal thing, or even a prototype for this seasonal thing, to making costumes, both for myself and other people. And even the costumes are still heavily based in editorial and what would typically be considered a fashion perspective, but it's more for installation work, or it's for the music project that I've been working on, or it's a specific piece for a client that has a show coming up, which I've always done on the side, but it's really starting to be something that I can find a lot of personal growth and fruition in, where I'm working, just being out here, I'm working with people whose viewpoint and what they're doing with their music or whatever I can really relate to, whereas it's not drudgery anymore. It's not like, oh God, I have to make these pants, you know? I need more. I can't just I can't get into that anymore. Like, I want someone to I want to have a visceral connection, which I think is what everyone wants. Well, no, I don't know, I can't speak for everyone, but it seems to be that, that's the goal, is, you have this crazy thing with someone when you're, and, that's why you have sex, and for me, that takes, an intense physical moment to establish. And, it's also a mental thing, in the sense that if there's not an equally intense connection for me in terms of a very intentional connection and me deciding ahead of time that I'm going to have sex with this person because I like this and that about them, this really attracts me, then it sometimes I won't even be able to get it up. It's just I'll try and get into the moment because it was there, and then it's just went home with this boy after the drag march, which was the same day that they legalized gay marriage. But we went back to his place, and he told me, I think on the way or immediately before we went to his place, that he had contracted HPV, and so, his frontal regions were off limits. And that was interesting for me, being someone who's really fond of dick. But we were just sort of clothed and grinding on each other and making out, and then as we were making out, he slapped me, and I just looked at him and I started laughing, and I slapped him back, and soon we were just slapping the shit out of each other back and forth, and it was so fun, and it was it was, we were slapping each other, and in another situation that might have been something that was disturbing or aggressive or uncalled for, but it was the context was trusting, and so we were able to access each other in that way, and that's what I like about it. Is it's just another way of being physical with someone. Criticisms that I held about New York. I wanted to live here for years. I don't think I even realized how long until recently, but it was a long time coming, and I thought it was a lot of things, and then actually looked into what was going on in New York and realized that it wasn't really any of those things. Those were just what was marketed about why you should want to live in New York City. But I think if anything, it's the amount of collaborators I found out here and people who are doing things that genuinely interest me. I hesitate to say like-minded people because I don't think there's any level of assimilation to it. It's that there's a multitude of people, and at any given point I can go out and walk down the street and meet someone who's had a vastly different life experience that's doing something that's still amazing to me and that I really want to be a part of and observe and participate in and engage with on multiple levels. And so that's a huge thrill. I also think that there's so many resources out here, especially for someone who's trying to work creatively. I've never found a place where it was so easy to access materials and spaces and opportunities to create things with other people, where you don't have to be faced with this dichotomized option of work alone or get tens of thousands of dollars to hire a cast and crew, which definitely was what I experienced when I was out in LA. I'm sure that's not everyone's experience, but that was a lot of what I found out there, and that hasn't been the case here at all. admitting, like, even if there's no sexual attraction, even if you're not going to have sex with this person, like, I've had relationships where I had a professional engagement with someone, or, you know, whatever context we were in, we weren't acknowledging ourselves as sexual beings, and once we just sort of like loosened up and we're like, oh yeah, whatever, I fucked this person or something, all of a sudden it opened this door of like, oh, I can actually talk about my life, I can talk about who I am and what I'm interested in, and like, I go home and I like to eat potatoes au gratin, you know. But it's like, you can't talk about these things because like there's so many things that you're not supposed to tell people, and that you're supposed to hide because they're not okay to talk about. And so I don't know, sex is a huge part of that for me, and it goes beyond any sort of categorization of being personal or political or anything. It's just like, what is for me, and frequently like sex is the thing that's behind a lot of that. Oh God, it's so complex. It's to an extent it's a love-hate relationship for sure. I, like many people, I take issue with traditional masculinity. It just sort of pisses me off, but you know, it also really attracts me, and I can't really lie about that. But I don't know. Physically speaking, in terms of like what I look for physically when I'm hooking up with someone, I really like dick. Like it appeals to me. I like interacting with dick. I like sucking dick. I like getting fucked, and that's like what it is. But it's also, I don't know, another layer of it is that the guys that I tend to go for, who usually are, you know, cis men that identify as male, are also usually not, they don't identify as masculine. You know, it's either very feminine men or androgynous, or like, I don't really give a fuck about gender, so I'm going to be whatever I am, which is usually the best of all. But yeah, I don't know. I'm attracted to glitter boys for sure. So, I don't know. I think I'm opening up as well, though. Maybe a couple months ago, I hooked up with a trans masculine person, and that was the first time I had done that. So it was a really new and positive experience of like finding how I could engage sexually with someone outside of what traditionally was my comfort zone of like, oh, I know I can suck dick really well, so I'm like gonna just go for this, and that works, you know. And it was like, what do I do now? We don't have a vibrator, we don't have a strap on, all we have is like digits and mouths and our bodies. And so you know, this person was really, really friendly and kept it very consensual and kept checking in the whole time to like, what do you want to do, what turns you on, how can we do this? And so it was good, but it was also really thrilling for me to be taken out of a comfort zone where I'm used to being someone that's not necessarily bossy, but very confident in like my role and what I'm going to do, even if that role is constantly changing. And so to be in a situation where I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing, how does this happen? It was fun.